Think India's JGU chapter and the Indic Studies Society, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone for joining us today. We have the privilege of having with us for today's session on the scope of rights of a juristic person, one of the biggest luminaries in the field of constitutional law in our country, Shri C.S. Vaidyanathan sir. Shri C.S. Vaidyanathan is a practicing senior advocate at the Honorable Supreme Court of India. He completed his LLB at the early age of 19 and went on to join the chambers of Shri K.K. Venugopal, the current Attorney General of India. He was designated as a senior advocate in 1992 and has also formerly served as the Additional Solicitor General of India. He is revered as an expert in the field of constitutional law and has argued landmark constitutional cases, including those pertaining to the right to education, the banning of lottery, reservation, the abolition of death penalty, and much recently, the Ram Janmabhoomi dispute, where he appeared on behalf of the deity Ram Lalla Virajman. Today, Mr. Vaidyanathan is an eminent lawyer having an excellent standing at the bar. I'd now like to request our very own Anujay Srivastav to deliver the keynote address and brief us about the topic before we request the presence of Mr. Vaidyanathan himself. Over to you, Anujay.
Thank you, Brigu. I would like to first thank Vaidyanathan sir for being here and presenting his thoughts to us. Secondly, I would like to thank the JGU Indic Studies Society for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me as an alumnus of Jindal Global Law School to do this. Now, I would like to introduce you all to this concept of juristic person briefly and to tell you why it is relevant for us today. Just to start off, the Indian Constitution itself does not talk about juristic person expressly. Since the Indian Constitution is silent on this, our courts have often gone to common law to find out what is this concept of juristic person, which is often called by common law lawyers as, an artificial person. Now, the Indian judiciary has often relied on Salmon as a scholar to talk about juristic persons. Various legal systems have extended the concept of legal personality beyond natural persons. We often see in a constitution that the term person is used. So whether it connotes, a broader variety of individuals, a broader variety of institutions which are being recognized as persons is something that is of relevance to us. And under common law, a juristic person is opposed to a natural person in the understanding or a human being. Juristic person is an entity as per Salmon, which the law vests whom with a personality. A juristic person has the capability to bear interests, rights, and duties, which is something that has been recognized by the Apex Court in the early decisions following the Constitution, and it is something which is still maintained today. It is also noted that it is only the juristic person's personality which is fictitious as opposed to, its other rights. It is often said that a juristic person, as per Supreme Court judgments, that is a legal person to the extent that the law recognizes the rights and duties ascribed to them, whether by statute or judicial interpretation. The Supreme Court has recently recognized in various cases that a juristic person is an idol, like an idol of a Hindu temple is considered to be a juristic person. An idol is also a juristic person in whom the title to the properties and endowment vests, and such juristic person has to act through human agency, such as the shibate. Those of you in the legal community would be very aware of this term. It has often been recently held that merely because a deity has been granted limited rights as a juristic person under statutory law does not mean that the deity necessarily has constitutional rights, something which the legal community is divided upon. And to lastly tell you something about a landmark recent development, the Data Privacy Bill, the Protection of Data Privacy Bill of 2019 talks about juristic entities as someone who is included under the definition of data fiduciary and data processor. Now, this indicates that the Indian Parliament wants to have a legislative intent to hold juristic entities, amongst other persons, accountable to individuals for collection and processing of their personal data. With this, keynote, I'd like to now tell the ground rules that will follow after Vaidyanathan sir commences his speech. Once Vaidyanathan sir's speech is complete, the moderators will be asking 2 questions to Vaidyanathan sir, following which the discussion will be open to everyone. To ask a question regarding the today's session, you have to keep your questions short not exceeding 30 to 45 seconds. And you have to ensure that your question is not in the form of a comment. It has to be strictly related to the concept here. And also you have to put your questions after Vaidyanathan sir has completed his speech in the comment box. And we will be determining in a chronological order on a first come first serve basis as to who gets to ask their questions. We'll be inviting them to do that. If there's anything that Brigu wants to say, he can add it after my speech is done now.
Yeah, so just one small little point after that. So the thing is, since this is a Jindal based event, we will be giving Jindal students the first priority or the first right to speak, and then we'll open the floor up to any others who are present. But due to the paucity of time, we'll have to give the priority to Jindal students. I hope you understand that. Thank you. Sir, now I request you to start, please.
Good evening, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be with the faculty and students. I learn a lot from all of you. Every such opportunity throws up, it gives me an opportunity to reflect and then improve upon myself and upon my awareness of the legal aspects. And I think today's subject is a very, very interesting subject where I would like to hear a lot from all of you. You know, when these generations ago, in fact, several centuries ago, when we were all nomads, there was no need or occasion for anyone to claim any right as a juristic person. And why? Till the agricultural settlements came, the right was of the group, of the community. Everyone shared everything. There was no individual property. I think the prime concern was for everybody was survival and therefore collective protection. Individual aspirations and desires were subsumed in the collectivity. The tribe, the tribal rights. In India, it was more like the Gana, the right of the Gana, the tribe. When from the Gana, it came to Vamsha and then to Kula. So you had progressively smaller group of people who started asserting the right to property as against the others, as against the larger community. Then these questions arose. I think for the purpose of ensuring that no group or no individual claims right to property over what is the right of the group, the collectivity, the community, certain ground rules started being laid. Whether it was India, whether it was in the Roman law or the Greek law, wherever you go, you have concepts like res sacra, res publica. You have the jus publicum, res nullius. Now, what are these? Therefore, there were certain properties which were either sacred and therefore nobody could own it, or there were certain properties which are for the sake of the larger community, the group. Therefore, no individual could claim it. It is when this segregation of property started that you had to identify a person who could be the owner of this property, which is in the nature of a collectivity, And therefore, this system started. Legal system has to know the identity of the person it seeks to govern, it seeks to protect, it seeks to administer. Therefore, what are the rights, entitlements, liabilities, and duties of that identity, the group identity? Then this concept of juristic person, an artificial person, an entity which was not a human being, that arose. I must clarify that even amongst human beings, we have unfortunately had categorization of legal persons and persons who did not or who could not claim right. They were virtually non-persons in the legal sense. Till recently, till almost 150 years ago, a country which today is recognized the world over as a leader in terms of democracy had treated the blacks as slaves. They were really non-persons. They were not legal persons. There was a time in our history, though not in the ancient times, though not in the Vedic times, but in the medieval time, that we had treated some persons as non-persons, not as persons entitled to any right to possession, property, ownership. Anyway, those are things of the past. Today, Constitution recognizes equality of everybody, recognizes the right, not just the right of voting, but right to property, right to opportunities. All these are well recognized. Now, when we therefore look back, the focus has mainly been on the right to property. It is from the perspective of enforcement and protection of the right to property that this concept of juristic person has evolved. Therefore, we recognized properties which had been endowed for a particular purpose on the basis of the pious purpose, as whether in the form of a deity or idol or endowment or a pagoda temple, we recognize the right. Then when the commercial dealings started considerably, the corporations, the companies were recognized as artificial person. This was more to protect them in the not merely in respect of the properties, the right to carry on business, but also to limit the liabilities. In a sense, the corporations and companies came in for shielding them from being proceeded against except in regard to what has been contributed by the members or the shareholders towards the company. Therefore, the other properties of the individuals could not be proceeded against. So this was a convenient device for the purpose of starting a business or protecting property. Liabilities were limited. Then you had the institutions, the state as an institution. The Constitution has created several entities which are all, in a sense, juristic persons. whether it is the Election Commission, whether it is the Public Service Commission, whether it is the RBI, SEBI, so many entities, each one of them. Therefore, these are all juristic persons, and their rights are circumscribed either by the Constitution, which has created it, or by the statute, which creates it. Therefore, because their existence is dependent on the authority which has created. Therefore, the statutes which have created the juristic person, which has conferred recognition or authority on that juristic person, limits the rights. We are not going to speak about that today. At least I am not going to focus on that. Because those are governed by the statutes, the constitutional provisions, etc. And I would slightly deviate from the historical perspective in regard to how this system of juristic persons started and shift the focus from only property to other rights. What are the other rights of the juristic person? Are there any other rights? The Constitution recognizes that India is a mosaic of diverse culture, religion, languages, sex, various other diversities. It has assured the different religions the right to faith and belief, the cultural rights to diverse sections of people, all linguistic groups, minorities, majorities, all of them are entitled to the rights. There is recognition in the Constitution of a group like a religion, a religious denomination, a linguistic minority, etc. These have rights. No one has today looked at from the perspective that these collectivities, these communities, these groups are really in the nature of a juristic person and they have rights. I want to focus on that, away from the property. If a pious and benevolent purpose can lead to the creation or recognition of a juristic person like an idol or a deity for the benefit of the devotees, why do we boggle when we come to recognizing such religious denomination, religious groups, minorities, or linguistic groups as a juristic person? Maybe from a point of view of enforcement of the right to property, history, necessity, and convenience, as the Supreme Court has said in the Ayodhya case, for the purpose of according a recognition to a juristic person, has not compelled us to have identification of such groups as juristic person. But I think a stage has reached when, while asserting the constitutional rights which have been accorded to these groups, the cultural right, the rights of language and religion, we need to seriously consider whether they should be recognized as a juristic person. Now look at this. There is today in the Sabarimala case, when it was sought to be argued by Sai Deepak that the idol is entitled to certain rights. Justice Chandrachud, the others haven't spoken, Justice Chandrachud rejects this submission. Justice Chandrachud rejects this submission on the basis that you can't assert a fundamental right of a juristic person. It is only in respect of a person who is a human being, a legal person, that you can assert it. That I am not sure. I have serious dispute in regard to this aspect. What rights? That's a different thing. But as to whether at all you can assert a juristic person, whether a right can be asserted in regard to what was asserted in the Sabrimala case, to right to exclude. Why? Because I want to preserve my identity of a Naishtika Brahmacharya, of a Naishtika Brahmachari. Therefore, Ayyappa as an idol, as a juristic person said, look, in the pantheon of gods, in the Hindu tradition, I am a person who has been recognized with certain divine powers, with some sanctity. People worship me. And this arises out of my character as a Naishtika Brahmachari. That is an essential part of it. So is that right not something which can be asserted under Article 25 and 26? And I think the 9-judge bench will have an opportunity and should consider this question as to whether a juristic person can assert. Now, Constitution has made a distinction in Part 3 itself, in regard to fundamental rights, between citizen and person. So certain rights are available only to citizens, like Article 19. Certain rights are available to all persons. Now, when you say person, will it not include a juristic person? Why should it exclude? When Constitution, in Chapter 3 itself, in the Fundamental Rights chapter itself, confers special rights on religious groups, religious denomination, linguistic groups, linguistic minorities, cultural groups. Why should that, therefore, not be treated as rights of the juristic person? This is a question, I think, which needs consideration, and therefore I am flagging this. During the course of questioning, if any further occasion arises, I would deal with it. I go on to the next issue. Should a juristic person definition, even on the test of beneficial or pious purpose, etc., be declined to a place of religious significance? A place which is considered sacred for certain special reasons. For the time being, let me start with the place of birth of Jesus, place of birth of the Prophet Muhammad. They are considered sacred, important, divine. People go there, people worship. Now, it is not that there are huge number of places like this, place of birth of Buddha perhaps. Now, likewise, amongst the Hindu pantheon of gods, we have, and certain claims, we made a claim in regard to Ram Janmasthan as a place, as a property, as a piece of land entitled to recognition as a juristic person. Now, the submission was made that you have land as a property of a deity, you have land as the abode of deity. That is where a temple comes up, where pagoda comes up. Therefore, that is the abode of the deity. But land itself can be a deity. Like if it is venered, revered by a large section of people as because of the birth of a divine being, that place is sanctified. Now, I think one of the prime considerations is my view, and you will find echoed in some parts of the judgment in Ayodhya. I think the bench was quite concerned about claims that may be made in regard to Krishna Janmabhoomi, Krishna Janmasthan in regard to Mathura or any other place. No, but the reasons which have been given, I just want to indicate to you some of the reasons which have been given. Is that there is no manifestation of the divine in that land. No. Is there a need for a manifestation like, a symbol there, an identification, a stone, a tree, something like that, for it's being recognized as a juristic person? I think the faith and belief is because the birth took place there, it is sacred. Now, second objection that was taken was, there is no dedication. The very fact that the birth took place there, that is the dedication. You don't need a formal dedication in any other manner. There are trusts and foundations, endowments, which are created by dedication by a person who is the founder of the trust, founder of an endowment. But in the case of a birthplace of a divine being, you don't need either a manifestation or this kind of a dedication. The third objection which was taken was the determination of such a juristic person will be based on the faith and belief of devotees. And if you, in the constitutions, segregate the religious from the secular, and if you are going to rely on the faith and belief of one section, you are excluding the right being asserted in regard to that piece of property by persons who do not have the same faith and belief in regard to that place being sacred and divine. I think there is a kind of clouding of thought in this approach. It is not every place in respect of which such a claim can be made. It is unique. It is not ubiquitous. It is unique. It is the exception. It is not the rule. You don't have several places which are being claimed as birthplace of Jesus or of Prophet Muhammad or of Ram. Therefore, I think this apprehension of the judges that there will be multiple claims and which will cause problems, I don't think was really there. It's not a right to property that is being claimed. That property itself cannot be owned by anybody. There is nobody who can claim right to property. Therefore, they confuse the thinking based on the conferment of legal personality for legal protection of endowed property. And therefore, they said we can't give legal impregnability to the property. I think this is the mistake. It is in respect of very, very exceptional situation that you are going to give the legal impregnability. And needlessly confined yourself to a situation where you wanted to confer or recognize the juristic person entitlement only to protect or enforce the right to property of a person. I think there are much larger concepts which are involved, and much larger rights which are involved. As I indicated, rights arising from the Chapter 3, the fundamental rights chapter of the Constitution. I think these are some of the issues that I wanted to flag. And I now want all of you to interact and then raise issues, which I think we need to carry forward, because I think this is an approach. So far, we have focused only on property. I want to move away from property, not confine ourselves only to property.
Thank you so much for that, sir. Thank you so much. Now we'll be opening the floor up to questions, but first we have Professor Shayan Mukherjee who wanted to ask the first question. So Shayan sir, if you can just unmute yourself and.
Yeah, Brigu, just a second.
Sure, sir.
Am I visible and audible?
Yeah, you're visible and audible.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, so first of all, that the thing that the rights that the thing is that the rights of a family or a trust, it's essentially belongs to, I mean the rights of a juristic person is essentially a rights in relation to right to property, is something that I think has died with the death of Soviet Union, because that stream of thought, that string of thought has died. Economic reductionism, as you would call it. So family as an institution is much more than, or a trust is much more than keeping, is being a custodian of a property, right, sir? So I think so that is a comment that I would want to make on your lecture. And my question is this: that is, you are essentially trying to pit. The Sabarimala issue is essentially trying to pit an individual's right vis-a-vis a community's right, right? So now, in that situation, what is the scope of the Constitution? Now we can build a wave of moral arguments as to what is right and what is not, what is wrong. But as a teacher of law, I am interested in what is there in the Constitution, and what is your take on that? Okay. When an individual's right is pitted against a community's right, and if there is any scope of community right in the Constitution at all?
I think there are three interests which have to be balanced, three rights which are being asserted. I think one is the right of the women who are excluded, the group of women, some group of women who are excluded, the right to equality. The second right is being asserted is the right of devotees, who say that we have faith and belief in a God who is a Naishtika Brahmachari, and therefore we want to preserve our religious right, our faith and belief in regard to it. The third, which was sought to be asserted, which was denied in the Sabarimala case, was the right of the deity, the right of the idol to protect itself. You recognize idol as a juristic person. Why allow your mind to boggle when you confine that right only to a right to property of that idol, and not a right to faith and belief, or to preserve its individual identity as a Naishtika Brahmacharya? Therefore, according to me, there are three conflicting rights which have to be balanced, but two essentially in the realm of faith and belief, one in the realm of equality. This is the balance which we'll have to arrive at. Now, I think strictly speaking, I mean, this is an aspect which ninth judge bench will have to consider. This question has arisen in the under the Canadian Constitution. It has arisen under the South African Constitution also, where, in fact, in South Africa, the situation was in respect of a Hindu girl right to access to a school, which when she wanted to put on an earring, and then the school said, no, you can't wear that. So the cultural right was sought to be asserted by that person, and they balanced it. And that balance is what I think we really need to look for. But I think I personally believe that Justice Chandrachud's judgment, to that extent, denying completely the right, is perhaps not quite right, and will hopefully be reconsidered.
Bhrigu, can I ask a supplementary?
Sure, sir, but we'll just keep it as short as possible. But
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, Mr. Vaidyanathan, yeah, but my approach to you with that question was yes. I mean, I'm very much critical of Chandrachud's judgment on Sabarimala, and I'm very much an advocate of Justice Indru Malhotra's dissenting opinion on that.
Yes.
Yeah, but the thing is that is there a my question was very specific. My question was, is there a scope of community rights under Indian Constitution?
Yes, I think absolutely.
For the majority there is very specific. For the minority there is very specific rights. But is it there for the majority? That's the question.
No. Therefore, the question is, why do you need a right for the minority? Because you provided safeguards to ensure that their rights are not trampled upon, their rights are not overridden by the majority. Now, that doesn't mean that the majority doesn't have the rights. Majority's rights are very much there, but you don't need in terms of special protection. But the rights, the fact that they have rights is recognized. The fact that they have rights that can be asserted by the adult suffrage, perhaps, whatever reason, but the right is there. Now, therefore, I think we need to, the groups, when you talk of groups, in fact, one of the things which is not part 3 right, take even right of political parties, an association of persons. Whether today one is a majority, tomorrow another is a minority. Why I have taken this example of a political party is, in respect of religion or language or culture, your birth gives a stamp in regard to your identity, right? In regard to a political party, there is no such stamp, and the majority can keep changing. Now, the fact that a group identity has certain rights as a juristic person, I don't think can be denied. So, therefore, you consider situations where the majority can become a minority as things progress. Therefore, it is in respect of certain classes, the majority is determined by birth. And there are some who are classified as minority. But tomorrow the situation may change. Constitution recognizes that a person, faith and belief, you have freedom. Which means today, if you are deemed, as it were, to be a Hindu or a Muslim because you are born to Hindu parents. 100 years from now, when this kind of interreligious, intercaste marriages take place, language marriage take place, what happens? How do you determine the identity? Constitution is not for 50 years, 100 years. It's for all time. Therefore, you have to envisage such situations.
Bhrigu, can I ask a very short third supplementary?
Sure, sir, but we have to keep.
Last, nothing else. Nothing
Okay.
else. Mr. Vaidyanathan, I completely agree with your point, and I run an elective called comparative equality laws where I basically say these things. But my question is that is there a constitutional justification for what you are saying? Is there anything in the text of the Constitution which says that there is specific rights for the majority as well, just the same way as there are in the with the majority?
Article 14. Article 14, when it talks of equality and equal opportunity, it doesn't make a distinction between majority and minority. That is the main right. You have further special protection in respect of minorities, but Article 14 is the right. Article 14 is the right of equality and equal opportunity. You don't need any other right. Therefore, if the minorities tomorrow are going to be given some special consideration, the majority can come and say, look here, I am entitled to equality. Why have I been deprived of that? Today, one of the questions that is going to be raised in regard to Hindu religious and charitable endowments which are regulated. Why are you regulating only the Hindu religious and charitable endowments and not the Christian churches?
That has been a tradition, historical tradition.
No, the history cannot justify that. Equality and equal opportunity means you can't discriminate only the Hindu establishments. I think this is a question that will arise in the 9th judge bench. So that there you will get the answer, hopefully.
Thank you, sir. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. So now we'll have Anujay, who gave the initial keynote address, to ask his question, and then we have quite a few people from the chat box. We'll have Nitish Raj after this. Anujay, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
So, sir, my question is also on the originalist line. This is regarding certain things which were held in the Sabarimala judgment. So the majority of Justices Deepak Mishra, Justice Chandrachud, and Justice Nariman, they noted that a DT, which may be a juristic person, is not a person under Part 3 of the Constitution and cannot exercise fundamental rights. However, this, in my opinion, at least in the originalist interpretation, which can be Mr. Scalia's interpretation or a regular originalist interpretation, it appears that, there is no explicit restriction on the term person to, exclude juristic persons or juristic entities. So do you think that, this judgment, the Sabarimala majority, it appears to mark a departure from, a Constitution's originalist reading? And, if you, whether do you agree with this, thing which has been done by the majority? And if yes, do you feel that, there is any danger in recognizing fundamental rights, if the majority were to rule otherwise? Thank you.
As you are aware, that issue has been referred to 9 judges, and this is one of the issues that will need consideration. I think the right in regard to also of an idol, of a deity, as a juristic person, whether it is deprived of its fundamental rights. I think it's an aspect which is going to be argued, and I personally believe that there is no justification for exclusion. And as I pointed out earlier, the Constitution has made a departure where it wanted to confine itself only to legal persons, the human beings, and that to those who are citizens. Therefore, it has confined itself. When it said person, it has not. Now you look at the situation anomaly. As a person, the right of a company under Article 14 can be asserted. That is a juristic person. A company is not a legal person, is not a human being. In the Telco case or Bennett Coleman case, in regard to assertion of Article 19 right, they said a shareholder alone can assert that right because the company is not a citizen, therefore Article 19 right cannot be asserted. But in respect of Article 14, it was held that a company can assert a right. Therefore, that is, it is already decided by earlier 7 judge benches And therefore, to that extent, the 5-judge bench which holds that a juristic person is not entitled to fundamental right is clearly contrary to the earlier 7-judge bench judgment, which has taken the view that a company can assert a right to equality under Article 14. Therefore, I think perhaps they were not cognizant of that judgment, perhaps. To that extent, it's per incuriam.
We have Nitish Raj next. Nitish, can you unmute yourself, or do you want me to read your question?
Yeah. Hi, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yes, though you have partly answered my question was regarding the company, that what is the status of fundamental rights of a company and which all can it claim under the Indian Constitution, especially with respect to the Article 25. And my second question is related to, I wanted to know your opinion on the November 2019 judgment of Justice Nariman in the Sabrimala reference case.
No, what is the question? That's one is about the company. Second, what is the second question? In regard to Justice Nariman's judgment?
Yes, in the Sabrimala November 2019 reference.
No, he has not gone into the question of whether a juristic person can assert a fundamental right. But in any case, broadly, my view is, I think, as you rightly pointed out also, Nitish, see, once a company can assert a right under Article 14, and there are other rights which are recognized in respect of persons and which can be asserted, then there is no reason why a juristic person cannot assert a right in regard to Article 25, 26, 29, 30, etc. Therefore, I think this is something which should certainly require reconsideration. I think it was an observation which I don't think can be sustained in the light of the earlier view of the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Thank you for that, sir. Thank you, Nitish. We have Aryan Gupta next. Aryan, can you unmute yourself?
Good evening, respected sir.
Good evening.
So my question was that does that mean that there will be any property will be deemed as sacred? Any property can be deemed as sacred will be a juristic person. Wouldn't this create a parallel legal system altogether and overburden the already delayed justice system in the country?
See, how many such claims do you envisage? I mean, let's be realistic about it. I think this needless apprehension in regard to several persons making such claims, I don't think is really something which need to, detain it, because it's not like, a Jesus or a prophet or Ram or Krishna is not born in every place where, because of their special significance, there is a divinity attached to that place. Maybe Guru Nanak. I mean, these are all exceptions. You have to consider, in the whole world, you might be able to name 10 people, 10 or 15. Beyond that, I don't think you will be able to. And it's not as if it's huge. I mean, infinitely small in terms of numbers, in terms of areas. Therefore, I don't think we should be overly concerned about this. I think the judicial impregnability that you apprehend will be given to this kind of special class of property, I don't think is going to extend to very many of them. So it's, and are there such places where there are rival claims, disputes? See, you have also to consider, one, in respect of how many places there can be such a claim. Two, in respect of how many of them there can be rival claims, disputed claims. That is the second issue. So I don't think we need to be unduly worried about that.
Thank you so much for that, sir. Thank you, Aryan. So we'll just take one last question now. Aditya Krishna, are you here? Aditya, can you please give your question a little short if possible? We just have around 5 minutes.
For sure. So I just wanted to have your opinion on the conception of the Hindu community, or rather in this Sabrimala case, the community which specifically how do you say believed in that deity as a majority. And my main conception is this concept of a minority within the Hindu religion looked at as a majority.
No, sorry, will you repeat that question?
For sure. So my main question is basically this ideology of minorities and majorities, which is created in India. I was wondering your take on that. And the reason I'm asking this question is based on two aspects. One of Gandhi's sort of criticism of this aspect of majority and minority, which he spoke during the partition, as well as this concept, which I read in a recent paper by Dr. Matthew John, where he spoke about the conception of majority and minority being created as a response to British India's justification against India's independence. Now, the question which I'm relating to judgment is this concept of creating a small sect within Hinduism, which already has its own specific beliefs, separate from the majority Hindu community, and looking at them as part of the majority instead of a minority. Just your views on that.
See, I think Hinduism is really not in that sense a religion. It's a way of life. It has so many different collective of people who have certain separate identities. And yet all of them collectively in a broad spectrum collectivity is known, they are all known as Hindus. That is why the Constitution recognizes denomination. You have a religion, you also have a religious denomination. That means in a religion, there can be persons holding different strains of thought. So therefore, all of them collectively would form a denomination. It is not as if they are, in a sense, hostile to or different from that larger collectivity of Hindus. They are also Hindus, believe in that, but then they have a, you have persons who worship Shiva, Saivites. You have persons who worship Vishnu. And there are some who are very, very rigid about that. Some persons who are Vaishnavites may not go to a Shiva temple at all. There are equally the other way. Therefore, that doesn't mean that they are not in the larger collectivity. Therefore, why do you treat one group as a minority, another group as a majority? This is a religious denomination. They have certain differences. They have certain separate ideas. But we are in that larger, mosaic. We are all in it together. So I think there is no need to divide ourselves on this basis. And then say that therefore it is an assertion of a minority right against the main group of Hindus.
Thank you so much for that, sir. So Professor Sayan Mukherjee wanted to have a small rejoinder on that. Yeah. And right after that, we'll wrap up. Anujay will give the vote of thanks. Thank you so much for my hand. Sayan, sir, can you unmute yourself and join?
Yeah. Mr. Vaidyanathan, just one thing in response to the question that was asked in relation to whether it's basically imposition of a majoritarian aspect on, it's basically a majoritarian assertion of Hinduism. The question essentially, in my opinion, as a rejoinder to your answer, is basically a political one and not a legal one. Whoever wants to assert himself as a Hindu can assert himself as a Hindu, and I don't think that there is in fact, in those cases, even the Ramakrishna Mission at one point of time claimed themselves as a denomination separate from Hinduism, as they claimed themselves as Ramakrishnavites, right?
No, Sri Aurobindo.
Sri
Aurobindo
Aurobindo.
was the, yeah.
I mean,
And they said
hearing,
we have a separate religious
I mean,
denomination.
hearing that argument, Swami Vivekananda
Anandamarg.
would have hanged himself from a ceiling. Hearing that argument, so I think that is basically a political question and doesn't depend on any legal intricacy upon that.
Yes,
So,
yes.
Aditya, if you're a student, that is a rejoinder, and you don't have to agree to that. Sorry.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, now I invite Anujay for the final vote of thanks. Anujay, are you here?
Yeah. So we would like to really thank you for coming here and sharing your thoughts with us and for the interactive session. I hope that you liked the questions interesting, and we are very happy to learn from all your legal opinion. At the same time, for everyone, thank you for your questions. And I think that almost everyone was able to ask their questions in this limited time. Sir, if you would like to say any final thoughts which you feel about this development of rights of a juristic person, you can say that, and then we can conclude.
No, I have nothing further to add, but I only wanted to say that our focus has mainly been on the property right of juristic person from the point of view of companies, corporations, and association of persons, firms, etc. I think we have to move away from the constitutional perspective. There are a number of other rights in respect of juristic persons, and I think we need to recognize that and carry them forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I had a good interactive session, and I'm very happy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. So
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining the session.